Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
At Easter lunch, while I was quietly cutting into my lamb, watching the pink juices bleed into the mashed potatoes like a slow spill of shame, my 81-year-old grandmother dabbed her lips with the corner of her floral napkin, turned to my younger sister with that familiar glow of pride in her eyes, and said, clear as a damn bell, Claire just joined the most exclusive golf club in the city. So classy. When will you finally make us proud, Natalie? I looked up, not even blinking, just gently twirling my fork through a roasted carrot like I hadn't heard her, like the whole table hadn't suddenly frozen in that one breathless moment that only ever comes before a storm. My father was still chewing, but slower now, his gaze dropping somewhere near the wine glass in front of him. My mother had that glassy look she always had when conflict hovered just outside the edges of her control, and Claire, well, Claire smirked like she always did. Smug and serene, like she was watching someone drown from a yacht. I smiled. Not a tight, fake smile either, but a real one. A slow curl, one I'd been saving for years. Then I set my knife down gently beside my plate, took a sip of the cold Pinot, and said with perfect calm, funny, I own that club. The silence that followed cracked like ice under pressure. Grandma's fork slipped from her fingers and clinked against the plate, sharp and metallic. Claire's jaw didn't drop. Claire never gives anyone the satisfaction of shock, but her wine glass stalled halfway to her lips, and her fingers tightened around the stem like she suddenly wasn't sure she belonged at this table anymore. And just like that, I had them. All of them. But if you think this story is about money or golf clubs or status, you're already missing the point. Because this wasn't about who had what or who paid more in property tax last year. This was about something far older, far deeper. This was about the slow rot that creeps into a family when you're never enough. When your entire identity is shaped around what you aren't, instead of who you are. When you're never the one who shines, no matter how bright you burn. See, in this family, I was the other daughter. The one who didn't become a doctor or a lawyer or marry one. The one who didn't go blonde at 16 or get straight A's or join a sorority. The one who didn't know how to wear lip liner properly or pick out the right fork at a steakhouse. The one who, according to my grandmother, was so bright, if only she'd just apply herself. But no one ever asked why I didn't. No one ever asked what I was doing all those years, while Claire was posing for engagement photos and my parents were sending Christmas cards with her baby bump featured front and center. I was the shadow on the family tree. Useful to hold things up, but not the branch anyone points at. They never once asked what I was building, and that was their first mistake. The second was assuming I wanted them to ask. Because the truth is, I didn't just keep my success quiet, I buried it. I wrapped it in silence so thick you could choke on it, and I did it on purpose. I didn't want applause. I didn't want their recognition. I wanted the moment. This moment. The slow, dawning realization across their smug, self-satisfied faces that the version of me they created, the failure, the joke, the quiet one who never quite got it together, had been a ghost for years. And the real me? The one who worked her ass off for 2 decades, who bought a crumbling golf course with a loan and a prayer and turned it into the hottest private club in the state. She was sitting right here, chewing her lamb slowly, sipping wine that cost more than my grandmother's handbag, and finally, watching their pride implode from the inside out. Wait, Claire said after a beat, her voice sharp but breathy, like she already knew this wasn't a bluff, but couldn't admit it yet. What do you mean you own it? I looked right at her and didn't blink. Exactly what I said. The thing about Claire is she's not dumb, she's dangerous, because she's smart, and she's used to winning. But she's also used to playing a game she knows the rules to. And suddenly, she realized I'd been playing a different game entirely. One she never even knew existed. I didn't say another word for the next 10 minutes. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me. You could hear Grandma's breathing grow heavier, the shifting of silverware against plates as everyone tried to pretend lunch was still happening. But it wasn't. Easter was over the moment I spoke. The lamb might as well have turned to ash. You ever feel like your whole life you've been shouting into a hurricane and nobody hears you? That every accomplishment you fought for is invisible to the people who are supposed to matter most? That no matter what you do, how far you go, they'll always see you as the potential that got wasted? That was me until today. I don't want you to think I did this for revenge. That would be too easy. This wasn't about evening a score. It was about finally walking onto the field and telling them they were never playing the right game in the first place. I didn't come here to explain myself. I came here to end the lie. And when Claire turned to me, her voice low and sharp, and said, "So what, you've been hiding money for years? You own a club now? Is this supposed to make me feel, what, impressed?" I just laughed. A quiet, low chuckle. Not cruel. Just tired. "You'll see," I said. Then I picked up my knife again, cut into that lamb, and smiled as I watched the juices run red across the plate. Because the truth hadn't even started bleeding yet. I was 8 when I first realized that in our family, love wasn't given equally. It was earned, hoarded, and strategically distributed like holiday china that only came out when company arrived. Claire, even then, had already been cast as the golden one, the center of our family's private little universe, the daughter whose report cards were celebrated like lottery wins, whose school plays drew the entire extended family in matching sweaters and folding chairs, while mine went unnoticed, unmentioned, or worse, corrected in pen before being silently returned to me with that familiar, disappointed sigh from our mother that said more than any sentence could. There was never an announcement made, no family decree that labeled us, and yet somehow, by the time I was 10, everyone knew Claire would be the one to shine, while I was the one to tolerate, to hope for, to manage like a chronic condition that flared up whenever someone asked about my future. Claire didn't just excel, she floated. While I was awkward and too bookish for my own good, always a little too blunt, a little too inward, Claire moved through the world with a kind of grace that felt manufactured, but was nonetheless effective. Her blonde hair always glinted in the sun like it had been kissed by angels, her teeth straight without braces, her laugh rehearsed just enough to sound spontaneous. She learned early how to nod at the right time, tilt her head when men spoke, and carry herself like she was never asking permission, only receiving praise. By high school, she was captain of the tennis team, student council president, and the girl everyone's mother whispered about as someone to watch. By contrast, I was quiet, hovering on the edges of the yearbook, probably miscategorized as either troubled or invisible, depending on whether you asked a teacher or a cousin. My parents never outright said she was their favorite, but favoritism doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. It oozes out in the tiny details. The way they leapt to her defense in arguments, but told me I needed to learn how to let things go. The way every birthday party Claire had was a coordinated affair with themes and matching decor, while mine were last-minute grocery store cakes with waxy icing and a few recycled decorations from her last bash. Even our grandmother, the queen of subtle digs and backhanded compliments, would routinely pull Claire aside and slip her $20 bills, just because, while looking at me with a mix of pity and vague disappointment. Like she was still waiting for me to do something remotely impressive before she'd acknowledge me as part of the family line. College only widened the gap. Claire, of course, was accepted early into a prestigious private university, the kind with red brick buildings and ivy crawling up the sides, where she met the man she would later marry. The son of a real estate tycoon who wore boat shoes in winter and had opinions about wine before turning 21. Their engagement photos looked like they belonged in a spread for a luxury bridal magazine, all soft focus and golden hour smiles, while I was still trying to figure out how to afford books without skipping meals. I remember our mother's face when she saw those photos, the way her hand clutched her chest, her eyes welling up like Claire had cured cancer instead of just landing herself a husband with a country club membership. That was the moment I knew nothing I ever did, not an award, not a job, not a single personal triumph, would make them look at me the way they looked at her in that moment. But the truth they never asked for, and never would have believed anyway, was that I wasn't jealous of Claire. Not in the way they assumed. I didn't want her looks, her charm, her expensive wedding dress, or the house in the suburbs with the circular driveway and matching monogrammed towels. What I envied, what gnawed at me in the quiet hours, was how easy it all seemed for her, how the world bent itself to fit her, while I spent every year of my life sanding down my edges just to be allowed in the room. And when I finally started to climb, when I started building something of my own from the ground up with blood, sweat, and no help from a single family member, I did it with the full understanding that no one at home would care, and more importantly, that they didn't deserve to know. Still, what they never saw, what Claire never even suspected, was that behind my quiet, behind the smile I wore at every birthday, holiday, and funeral, I carried a ledger. Not one of dollars and cents, but of slights, of moments. Every time they overlooked me, every time Claire was praised while I was passed over, every time a relative asked, "So, what are you doing these days, Natalie?" in that tone that's already certain the answer is nothing, I filed it away. And when Claire stole from me, not just figuratively, but literally, when she reached across the table of sisterhood and took something I created, twisted it, and sold it as her own, that was the moment the ledger turned into a map of revenge. But I didn't want revenge in fire. I wanted it in silence. In patience. In the long game. Because that's what they gave me time, years of it, to quietly prepare for the moment I'd take everything they thought they knew about me and unravel it, thread by smug little thread. So when Claire sat across from me at Easter, swirling her wine, telling us all with exaggerated humility how she'd finally been accepted into the prestigious Ridgeview Golf Club, they only took 2 new members this year. "It's practically impossible without connections," she said, with a glance toward our grandmother, who beamed like she'd birthed a Kennedy. I didn't say a thing. I didn't roll my eyes, didn't smirk, didn't even touch my drink. I just watched her, listened carefully to every detail she provided about the legacy families and the screening committee, about how her husband had pulled some strings, and how proud she was to be a part of a place with standards. And all I kept thinking as she basked in the glow of assumed superiority was, I wonder how she'll feel when she finds out she was screened by me. Because what Claire didn't know, what none of them had any reason to suspect, was that the very club she bragged about, the one she held up as proof of her status, had been quietly acquired by a limited partnership I had formed 3 years ago. Not under my name, of course. That would have ruined the entire plan. It was all carefully layered under holding companies and anonymous board placements, with me at the helm, always in the background, always unseen. Just the way I needed it to be until now. And when my grandmother, drunk on pride and cheap wine, turned to me and asked, "When will you finally make us proud?" I knew the moment had arrived. I didn't need their pride. I just needed their silence. And I was about to earn it, one stunned face at a time. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes not from proving people wrong in front of their faces, but from knowing in the quietest parts of yourself that you've already done it and that you didn't need their permission, their blessing, or even their attention to do so, only your own rage, hunger, and the private fire that comes from years of being overlooked, misjudged, and underestimated by the people who should have known you best. I never wanted the spotlight. I didn't need applause, or validation, or a seat at their suffocating dinner table of smug superiority where Claire sat like a crowned queen while the rest of us pretended to enjoy the scraps of her victories. What I wanted was leverage. What I wanted was to build something so undeniable, so unshakable, and so deeply mine that when the moment came, I could offer them a single glimpse of it, not out of kindness, but out of cold, calculated choice. What no one in my family ever understood, and never cared to ask, was that I didn't disappear after college out of shame or confusion or lack of options. I disappeared because I was building, brick by invisible brick, an empire of my own, one that required no help from them, no introductions to the right people, no polite dinners with golf shirt husbands and whispery real estate deals sealed over scotch and stale cigar smoke. While Claire was busy curating her perfect image and stockpiling compliments from people who wanted to bask in her glow, I was waiting tables at a hotel restaurant in Arizona, studying every corner of the hospitality business like it was a second language, learning not just how it worked, but how it failed, and most importantly, how it could be reinvented. Those early years were not glamorous. They were humiliating, exhausting, and so deeply isolating that I sometimes wondered if I'd disappeared for good. I remember scrubbing industrial kitchen floors at 3 in the morning because the dishwasher walked out halfway through his shift, and the manager, a gruff man who barely spoke to me during the day, said with a shrug, "You're still here, right?" I didn't complain. I didn't tell anyone. I just did the work. And then I did more. I saved. Every single dollar that didn't go to rent or food or a bus pass went into a tiny, ruthless savings account that I guarded like it was sacred. I didn't take vacations. I didn't upgrade my car. I didn't even own a decent pair of shoes for 5 years. But what I did have, slowly but surely, was knowledge, real, on-the-ground knowledge about how businesses failed, how staff got demoralized, how margins got bloated, and how guest experience was treated like an afterthought instead of a revenue generator. I moved. A lot. Phoenix to Austin, Austin to Nashville, Nashville to Raleigh. Each city brought a new job, a slightly higher title, and a little more access to the machinery behind the curtain. I went from hostess to assistant manager to operations coordinator to director of guest strategy at a boutique hotel chain that never once asked me about my GPA or what sorority I belonged to. They just cared that my properties ran lean and profitable. By the time I was 35, I was managing 7 locations across 4 states, flying in and out of cities with a battered carry-on and a head full of figures. And still, my family thought I was drifting. Still, they whispered at weddings and funerals about poor Natalie, the one who never quite got it together. And still, I said nothing. But the seed of the idea didn't come until I attended a corporate retreat at a failing golf resort outside Denver, a sprawling, beautiful piece of land with a hollow soul and broken systems. It was there, while sipping flat black coffee in a cracked leather chair and listening to some overpaid consultant explain how the only thing guests wanted was Instagrammable experiences, that I realized how many of these legacy spaces were vulnerable. Not because they lacked charm, but because they lacked imagination. Old money had built them, but old money didn't know how to pivot, didn't understand that younger professionals, rising entrepreneurs, and newly wealthy tech circles were searching for luxury experiences that weren't dusty, elitist relics, but something curated, intentional, and private. They wanted to feel special, not small. And that was when it hit me I could buy one. Not outright, of course. Not yet. But the plan formed like a steel spine inside me. I would find one of these crumbling clubs, quietly identify its pain points, and then, through a series of silent partners and shell companies, acquire it under the radar and rebrand it without ever putting my name on the deed. I had the knowledge. I had the numbers. I had the vision. All I needed was the capital and the patience. It took another 3 years. I gathered investors the way some people collect stamps, quietly, methodically, and only from those who saw the world the way I did. No loud venture capitalists. No legacy billionaires. Just hungry people who were tired of being cut out of old systems. And then I found it, Ridgeview Hills Golf Club, just 2 miles outside the very city where Claire and her perfect husband had moved. It was once the pinnacle of prestige, but had become bloated, underutilized, and desperate for cash. The bones were beautiful. The books were bleeding. I made an offer through a holding firm in Delaware and watched the transaction go through without a single raised eyebrow. By the time I officially owned Ridgeview, I had already overhauled its branding, replaced its leadership, and installed a tiered membership model that quietly priced out the kind of performative status seekers who treated exclusivity like a birthright. We kept the legacy charm but stripped away the arrogance. We added tech features, guest customization, discreet concierge services, and an unlisted top-tier membership for those who didn't want to be seen, only served. The club thrived. Word spread. And soon, the waiting list grew long enough to wrap around Claire's smug grin twice over. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't announce it on Facebook. I didn't slip it into conversation at Thanksgiving or text Grandma a photo of the new members' lounge. I let the silence do what it always does, protect, conceal, and sharpen. Until, of course, Easter Sunday arrived, and Claire, unknowing, radiant, bragging as always, announced to the table that she had finally been accepted into Ridgeview, with a flourish in her voice like she'd ascended some great social ladder. And all I could think was, "You climbed the ladder, Claire. I just happen to own the roof. There's a particular cruelty that only exists between siblings, a kind of emotional razor that cuts deeper than any insult from a stranger, not because the words are sharper or the betrayal more severe, but because it comes from someone who knows exactly where to slice, who's seen you in your most vulnerable state, not just without makeup or pretense, but stripped of dignity, hopes, and sometimes even your sense of self, and chooses, with chilling precision, to use that knowledge against you. Not in a moment of heated rage, but in calculated stillness. And that's exactly what Claire did to me. The betrayal that set everything in motion, the one that turned silence into strategy and my own heart into something that could only beat behind walls, didn't come out of rivalry or jealousy, or some dramatic fight that ended with slammed doors and tears on tile floors. It came like a kiss on the cheek with a knife behind the back, and the worst part wasn't that she took something from me. It was that, in the eyes of our family, she did it without consequence and worse, with their unspoken approval. I had spent nearly a year working on the idea. It was raw back then, rough around the edges, nothing more than scribbled napkins, late-night research marathons, and hours in coffee shops fueled by caffeine and that unshakable belief that I could create something worthwhile. It was a digital hospitality platform, something entirely different from what was on the market at the time, a hybrid app for boutique hotels and private clubs that personalized guest experiences using predictive behavior, artificial intelligence, and opt-in privacy filters that would allow high-profile guests to feel pampered without ever being put on display. I poured every ounce of myself into it, not just time and money, but my sanity, my confidence, my belief that I could stand tall in a world where people like Claire always got the seat at the table while women like me had to build the damn table ourselves. At the time, Claire was visiting me under the pretense of reconnecting, that sisterly instinct that usually kicked in when she was bored or between spa treatments. She had come alone, without her husband, and for the first time in years, she seemed genuinely interested in my life, or so I thought. She asked questions. She listened. She even took notes as I walked her through the early stages of the project, explained how it worked, who I was targeting, and why it mattered. I remember thinking, maybe this is the turning point. Maybe she finally sees me. Maybe, after all these years of being second best, overlooked, the afterthought in every family photo, Claire and I might actually become something close to what sisters are supposed to be. I couldn't have been more wrong. 2 months later, she and her husband announced, via social media, of course, that they were so proud to be partnering with a cutting-edge startup aimed at redefining luxury hospitality. The language was eerily familiar. The interface screenshots looked almost identical to my prototypes. And when I read the article in the local business journal that profiled their new innovative approach to concierge-level travel experiences, I knew without question that Claire had taken everything I'd shown her, handed it over to her husband's investor group, and branded it as their own. There were no calls, no texts, no explanations, just silence from her and stunned disbelief from me. I approached my parents, I still don't know why, maybe some deep-rooted need to be defended, or at least heard, and explained everything. I showed them timelines, emails, sketches. I pointed out the glaring similarities, the timestamps that proved the idea had been mine long before Claire had come to visit. And I'll never forget what my father said as he poured himself another glass of bourbon and stared down into it like it held the answers. You probably should have kept your work to yourself until it was protected. That's just how business works. My mother was worse. She didn't even look at me when she said, well, at least someone in the family is doing something impressive. That was the moment I stopped needing their approval. That was the moment the door closed not with a slam, but with a quiet click I knew I'd never reopen. I stopped calling. I stopped attending birthdays unless I absolutely had to. I didn't send updates. I didn't ask how Claire was doing. I let them believe whatever they wanted, let them build their little narrative in which I was the struggling one, the wayward daughter still figuring things out because it was easier than confronting the truth, that they had allowed one sister to steal from the other and applauded her for it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I got to work. Because while they were busy bragging about Claire's business acumen, I was learning how to legally outmaneuver them, how to structure contracts, how to create firewalls, NDAs, and protections so tight that not even a molecule of my new plans could slip through the cracks. And I never forgot. Not once. Every time someone at a holiday dinner asked me how the job search was going, as if I were still lost, unemployed, aimless, I smiled and said something vague. Every time Claire bragged about a new client or a feature her team had developed, I nodded like I was impressed, knowing full well her version of the app had plateaued, her downloads had stalled, and behind the scenes, the investors were quietly shifting focus to the next shiny thing. I didn't need to compete. I was playing a longer, deeper game. And unlike Claire, who had always relied on charm and connections and the illusion of effortlessness, I had built myself from the dirt up, and dirt remembers. So when I finally bought Ridgeview Hills, I did it with the full weight of that betrayal still humming inside me, not like a wound, but like fuel. I didn't want revenge that day, I wanted insurance. I wanted the kind of power that didn't have to be waved around to matter. The kind that could sit in the corner of a room, quiet and calm, and change everything with a single word. And when Easter came, and I watched Claire sip her wine and lean into our grandmother with that signature faux modest grin while saying, "It's basically impossible to get in," they rejected 3 of Mark's colleagues. I knew the time had finally come to speak that word. But not out of anger. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. Because sometimes, silence stops serving you. Sometimes, it starts to rot from the inside. And when our grandmother turned her eyes toward me, those same eyes that had once skimmed over every certificate I earned, every success I whispered about, and asked me when I would finally make the family proud, I realized I no longer needed her to see me. I only needed her to feel the weight of her ignorance. So I said it. Calmly. Precisely. Without malice, but without hesitation. Funny. I own that club. And in that instant, with a single sentence, the story they had told about me for years began to collapse. Not in fire. Not in noise. But in the kind of silence that follows an earthquake, total, sudden, and impossible to ignore. The strange thing about revenge, the kind that stews quietly for years, the kind that simmers just beneath your skin while you smile and nod and let everyone believe you're still the same passive disappointment they've always seen you as, is that when the moment finally arrives. When you're sitting at the table with a glass of wine in your hand and the target of your longest-held rage sitting across from you, beaming with the ignorance only entitlement can breed, you don't feel triumphant, or gleeful, or even vindicated. You feel still. Empty, almost. As if the act of winning was never the thing you craved, but simply the moment of clarity it brings, the unshakable knowledge that you were never broken, never lost, never incapable. Just deliberately underestimated for so long that even you began to wonder if they were right. And now, as I watched Claire blink once, then twice, processing what I had said, I felt that clarity settle over me like ash after a fire, soft, final, and strangely cold. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire table, once bustling with clinking cutlery, laughter, and the sound of my family congratulating themselves through Claire's accomplishments, had been put on pause by a single sentence. My grandmother, always quick to speak her mind, now stared at me with the hollow incomprehension of someone who just realized they were the last to arrive at a party they were supposed to be hosting. My father, whose confidence in Claire had always bordered on religious faith, suddenly seemed deeply interested in the condensation on his wineglass, as though answers might be hiding there. My mother, who had long ago mastered the art of social survival by saying little and smiling often, looked from Claire to me and back again, her lips parted just slightly, as if mid-thought, though the thought itself never came. Claire had not moved. Her fingers still gripped the stem of her wineglass, but her smile had tightened into a thin, brittle line, the kind that cracks under pressure. "You're joking," she said, finally, her voice smooth, but pitched just a little higher than usual, a signal only I would notice, because I had lived a lifetime in her shadow and knew every note of her performance. "You don't own Ridgeview." "That's absurd." I tilted my head slightly, not answering, not correcting, just letting the doubt wrap its fingers around her certainty. I had no need to explain. I had no desire to walk her through the web of trusts, holding companies, board proxies, and investment vehicles that made it all possible. If I had wanted her to understand the scope of what I'd done, I would have sent her a presentation. But I didn't owe her that. I didn't owe any of them a single word beyond what I had already said. "I've never heard your name mentioned," she added, now louder, a little more forceful, the edges of her composure beginning to fray. "That's the point," I replied, finally, my voice quiet but unyielding. "Some people build to be seen. I built to be untouchable." That's when I reached into my handbag, a simple, structured black piece that no one at the table had ever noticed, never realizing it cost more than their monthly mortgage, and pulled out a white envelope, thick and perfectly sealed, with Claire's full name typed on the front. I slid it across the table, past the mashed potatoes and the silver gravy boat, and stopped just short of her hand. She looked at it like it might be poisoned. "What is this?" she asked, even though I could see in her eyes that she already knew it was nothing good. I didn't speak. I just took another sip of wine and waited. She opened it. She read the single-page letter inside. And I watched as the blood drained from her face, leaving her as pale as the linen napkin on her lap. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Finally, she found her voice, weak and brittle. "Termination of membership? Effective immediately." The silence that followed was not the polite, expectant kind that fills a table before dessert is served. This was the brutal, suffocating kind of silence that takes up all the oxygen, the kind that swells in your chest when you realize the narrative you've been telling yourself and selling to everyone else has just collapsed in front of people you were trying to impress. Claire's eyes flicked to our father, who now looked visibly uncomfortable, as though the walls themselves were pressing in. Then to our mother, whose smile had vanished. Then to our grandmother, who was suddenly looking at me like she had never seen me before. "You had me kicked out?" Claire hissed finally, her voice venomous. "I didn't kick you out," I said evenly, not rising to her drama. "I declined your continued access to a private institution I own and operate under my discretion. The same discretion you've benefited from every time you told someone you were part of something exclusive." Her husband, who had thus far remained silent, probably because he was smart enough to realize that his place in this moment was purely ornamental, finally cleared his throat and asked, "Is this legal?" "Oh, entirely," I said with a pleasant smile. "But if you have questions, I'm sure your legal team can find someone on my board to clarify. I won't be involved in that discussion." For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. Because while Claire was smart in the way that the world rewards, charismatic, well-dressed, socially agile, she had never learned to build anything alone. She relied on the scaffolding of others, on inherited networks, on people's desire to be close to her shine. And now, without realizing it, she had stepped into a world I had designed, a world where the rules belonged to me, and where no amount of charm or connections would help her. I stood up slowly, brushing a hand down the side of my dress, and glanced around the table one final time. "Thank you for lunch," I said. "The lamb was excellent, though a bit overdone." Then I turned and walked out of that dining room, not with the strut of someone seeking attention, but with the stillness of someone who no longer needed to be seen, because the point had been made, the lesson delivered. And the silence that once stifled me had now been transformed into something I owned. As I stepped into my car and closed the door behind me, I expected a flood of satisfaction, a wave of long-awaited vindication. But instead, what came was something quieter, heavier, not regret, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Because revenge, no matter how cleanly served, always leaves a mess behind. I had delivered the blow with precision, yes, but now I had to live with what came next, a family permanently fractured, a sister silenced not by cruelty, but by consequence, and a truth too long buried finally forced into the light. And as I drove away from that house, the spring sun slanting through the windshield like a promise, I found myself wondering not whether they would forgive me, because I didn't care, but whether, now that I'd taken everything back, I still recognized the woman who had spent 2 decades becoming someone they couldn't ignore. Because sometimes, the victory you've been chasing turns out to be lonelier than the war that got you there.